Well, welcome to New Europe TV. We're in the European Parliament and we're speaking to a senior Labour Party politician here, Dr. Richard Corbett, MEP, who's been involved in European politics at a very high level for some time. I'm glad you can join us. And of course you join us just after your leader, Ed Miliband, has pledged to be part of a pro-European government should he win the election.
Well, yes, in contrast to the vagaries of the coalition government. And it was, I think, very important that on day one of the official election campaign, he made the statement that the threat of potential British exit, or Brexit as it's sometimes called, from the European Union, is actually the number one threat to Britain's economic recovery. It would be an absolute disaster for us economically.
Now, one of the things I'd like to ask you about is at your level, how has all of this talk of Brexit affected Britain and British politics in Europe? Because there's a lot of people who are very concerned.
Well, I know of nobody in the European institutions who wants Brexit. They would be very sad to see Britain going. But all this talk does sometimes mean they look rather warily at British demands and wonder, well, if you're asking for this and that, and you may not even be here next year. I think Herman Van Rompuy put it rather well. How do you convince a room full of friends to take a particular course of action if your hand is already on the handle of the exit door?
I think that was a very good metaphor that I think understood the case exactly. So when we're coming to all of this talk of Brexit and this kind of referendum, I noticed that Labour have resisted the calls and the pressure for them to, as it were, double down and call for a referendum themselves. Can you tell me a little bit about why and how Labour have decided not to go down that route?
Well, first and foremost, what David Cameron is proposing may sound superficially democratic. Let's reform the EU and then let people have a vote on it. But if you analyse it a bit further, it isn't really. It actually amounts to 2 rounds of blackmail. Round one, he proposes to say to other EU countries, I want this change, that change and that change, or else we're off, and I really mean it, and try and get concessions that they would otherwise not give. If he then gets those concessions, he's going to turn round to the British people and say, right, you have a choice between Europe as I've renegotiated it, maybe without the social chapter, the employment protections or other things. It's a choice between that Europe or leaving. So a choice between Cameron's Europe or no Europe. The status quo won't be on the ballot paper. A different set of reforms won't be on the ballot paper. It's his Europe or no Europe. And at that point, he will say, and don't even think of leaving. It would be economic suicide. It would be a political catastrophe. You better accept what I've negotiated. Take it or leave it. That's why it's actually not so democratic. Secondly, we recognise that reform is actually a non-stop process in Europe. That's what the EU does day in, day out. It's 28 countries working together to reform existing EU policies, to set common rules for our common market, to improve them, update them. That's what these institutions do all the time. It's not something that you define in 2015, negotiate in 2016, approve in 2017, and then it's done forevermore. No, it goes on and on. It's hard, tough work, and it's a process, not an event.
It's also one of the things that seems to be happening a lot more. At the moment, we seem to be in a process where we are really changing and really rethinking how things are going on. We had the Spitzenkandidat, which was the start of something. We've got the reshaping of the Commission, the 2 tiers of commissions, the clustering. It seems, when you look at it, there is actually a lot of change happening in Europe, and there's a lot of people who are already pushing for more change to meet these tremendous challenges that we have.
Yes, I think you're right. There's change at the systemic level, as you said. There's also ongoing policy changes. The significant reform of the common fisheries policy 2 years ago. Even Greenpeace said that was a really good change. That was really a change in a policy that badly needed changing, and it's happened. So ongoing hard work, day-by-day reform is worth the effort and it can get somewhere. You don't need to cause a crisis to get reform. That's what the EU institutions are all busy doing.
But I mean, in Europe, you get your way by building alliances and building a consensus and working with other people. And I'm sure that must be very similar to the process that happens in any individual political party. You know, but
Yes,
this is a team sport, as it were.
Indeed, and within countries. I mean, we all know that the European level is not perfect, nor is national government, nor is local government. But when something's wrong, what do? You try and improve it, you change the policy, you argue your case. You don't just tear the whole thing up and walk away.
So, if Britain does elect a Labour government and Mr. Miliband comes in with his pro-European attitude, what differences would you expect to see? What changes?
Well, I think we would be much more engaged in that day-to-day process of reforming EU policies, of improving them, of changing them, of updating them, rather than almost standing aside from that, waiting for some big bang arguments that changes the structures of the EU, or tries to. We would be involved in actually really making a difference day in, day out.
Yeah. And of course, I mean, one of the big problems is a lot of European politics, as we know here. It's all about the nuts and the bolts. There's nothing really kind of leaping out as being particularly newsworthy, but it's a hard day-to-day grind of getting things through and getting changes made, getting laws pushed through, which doesn't make good reporting for many times. But
that's indeed one of the problems of for people's understanding of the EU. So much of it is nitty-gritty detail on boring subjects that you know, it's hardly sexy.
Yeah.
Conversely, you can have something dramatic and sexy, but which would be a disaster.
Yeah.
If we did decide to leave the European Union, not only would we have to negotiate from scratch a new relationship with all our neighbouring countries and try and get some sort of access to that single market which is so vital for nearly 4 million jobs in Britain, we would simultaneously have to negotiate new trade agreements with every other country in the world to replace the agreement we now have currently via the European Union. So we'd have to negotiate with Japan, India, America, Singapore, all at the same time, and negotiate just as Little Britain without the clout of the whole of Europe, the world's largest market, behind us.
And there seems to be this kind of thing that an in-out vote will produce a quick and immediate result. If Britain chose to leave Europe, it would take decades to work all of the integration out again. It's not straightforward, is it?
No,
you know,
not at all.
So a vote to leave Europe is a vote for 20 years of prolonged negotiations about getting untied?
Well, in principle, the legal process of exit would be settled within 2 years, but there'd be so many loose ends to sort out. Your trading relationship, your access to other markets. What about the 2.5 million British people that live in other EU countries who would lose their automatic right to be living there as EU citizens if they were no longer EU citizens? All that indeed would take a long, long time to unravel.
Yes, and one of the things that I've seen is you know, it's hard to find people who are putting the pro-European case.
Well, Labour is.
Well, Labour is doing
the
now.
Dems
yes.
occasionally do.
Yeah, and part of the Conservative Party does.
Yes, the Conservative Party is badly split on Europe. On one side, there are those who want to leave under any circumstances, mostly on the far right of the Conservative Party. There are some on the more moderate wing, especially those close to business, who think that all this is crazy, and there is everything in between.
Yeah.
I sometimes say, though, as the party has moved more and more to a Eurosceptic position, that the remaining pro-European Conservatives, they are an endangered species. They should be afforded protection under the United Nations CITES Convention for Endangered Animals and given special protection from the rather vicious predators they have in their own party.
I must admit I can't see, for example, Mr. Hannan as a hunter-gatherer quite, but there must be many people who are finding the debate, like many citizens, just overwhelming and just uncomfortable, and I think the British public would probably say, sort it out, stop going on about it. Now, finally, what I would like to just ask you about is, when I've seen the cases being made for Europe generally, it's been on, this is good for business, this is good for trade, this is a trading relationship.
It's more than that, yeah. And our Shadow Europe Minister gave a speech just a few weeks ago to the Fabian Society, saying very clearly Europe is indeed vital for our economic interests, but it's not just about economic interests, it's about values. This is us and our neighbouring countries, who all happen to be functioning democracies, all have an interest in an open democratic system continuing to be strong. It's also about peace in a continent that was formerly ravaged by war. And if you look beyond the borders of the European Union, to the east, Ukraine, to the southeast, Syria, to the south, Libya, there's an arc of instability around us. And we and our neighbouring countries, democracies, working together, pooling our strengths, is actually rather vital for our future.
Because I think one of the great things about Europe that people may well not understand too well is soft power, the use of diplomacy, the use of mediation. We are actually involved in a lot of these conflicts, trying to help and trying to act as an honest broker. How can we get the pro-European message across, and a more accurate message? Because it seems that all of the newspapers and media can quite happily go with outrageous lies and untruths and exaggerations.
Yeah.
But you send them a correction,
and they don't print it.
You know, what can we do about this?
Well, in terms of the British written media, one of the issues is the pattern of ownership of it. A very small number of owners, 3 owners own, I gather, 67% of the national newspapers, if you measure it by readership statistics. And that means you have, because those 3 happen to be very anti-European as a matter of policy, even though they live abroad and are from abroad, that means from broadsheets to tabloids, you have a large number that are deliberately portraying the European Union in a negative light. Not as a one-off, but day by day, week by week, year by year. And of course that has an effect on public opinion over time.
So, I mean, you would be looking at ways of trying to strengthen links with Europe should Labour be elected, and of trying to correct this imbalance.
Trying to correct perceptions. You can say perceptions are political reality, but we've got to try and make sure that there is a more accurate understanding of the European Union, what it is, how it really works, and how it is actually in our interest and the common interests of Europe that it works well.
Well, thank you very much for coming to speak to me. It's, I hope you found that of interest, and if nothing else, it shows that perhaps the idea of a Brit being Eurosceptic is not the whole picture by a long way. Thank you very much, and thank you.
Thank you.